we looking at microscopes today?
We are. All right, guys. So far we talked about when we started figuring out what cells were, 1600s or so. Robert Hooke, other guy, Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Their work and the work of lots of other scientists helped formulate the cell theory. The idea that all organisms are made out of cells. Doesn't matter if it's plant, animal, fungus, or anything in between. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function, and all cells have to come from other cells. You can't just make a cell out of the blue. We talked about some characteristics that every cell has, whether it's bacteria, animal, plant, or so on. They all have a membrane, and its job is to do what?
Gateway something.
Gateway of the cell. Controls what can come in, controls what can go out. All cells have cytoplasm, which just sort of fills up the cell. All cells have ribosomes. What do? They make the proteins using directions coming from DNA, the nucleus. So all cells have DNA. All cells also have some supporting framework that we call the cytoskeleton. Then we spent a lot of time talking about the two main kinds of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells, we said, are like bacteria, cells that lack a nucleus. Lack what kind of nucleus? Enclosed, contained, membrane bound. They also lack what other important structures? What else do they not have? They don't have organelles. They do have cell membranes. They have walls to give them support and protection. They have DNA. It's just doing what? Floating around in the cytoplasm. Only real good examples are bacteria or bacteria-like organisms, and they are really tiny. And we talked about eukaryotes. And we said that word means true nucleus. True nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have a membrane-bound nucleus. They have lots of little organelles. And those little organelles allow them to do what? Be more efficient by dividing up the work, and each little organelle is a specialist, right? Each little organelle does a certain job. So it makes the cell much better, much more efficient. Examples, plants, animals, protists, fungi, and they are much, much larger than bacteria. Then we started talking a little bit about the different parts. Yesterday we talked about the membrane, the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. We said it's mostly made out of a layer of what? Two layers of what? What's the membrane mostly made out of? Two layers of lipids. It's called the lipid bilayer, right? The phospholipid bilayer. Lipids mostly are non-polar, which means what kinds of things can go in and out of the membrane with no problems. If the membrane is not mostly non-polar, what kinds of things can go through easily? Non-polar. Non-polar and non-polar like each other. Little things can go through pretty easily too. But there are lots of other things that might need to get in. So that's why there's some other parts of the membrane. The red things and the little tails coming off of them, those are the phospholipids. But all those blue things in there are what? Proteins. Proteins are kind of embedded, stuck into the membrane, and they give it certain functions. We talked about some different proteins in the membrane yesterday, like channel proteins. And what do we say these little channels do? Yeah, they allow like big things or maybe charged things to go in and out. We talked about these little proteins that stick out the surface of the cell. And we called them name tags or marker proteins. And we said that those are important for identifying your cells to what other part of your body. Those marker proteins, those name tag proteins, they're saying this is me. And who are they telling that to? Your immune system, so you don't attack yourself. We also talked about little things like these. We call those receptors. And what did we say receptors receive? Hormones, signals, messages from other parts of the body to do something like grow. Final couple of things we talked about yesterday. We mentioned the nucleus a little bit. We said in eukaryotes, the nucleus is an enclosure that holds the DNA. The little enclosure, the membrane that encloses it has little pores in it. Because what has to come out of the nucleus? Not the DNA stuff. The RNA has to come out. Also, there's a little dark spot in the nucleus called the nucleolus. What gets made there? Yeah. It's where the ribosomes get made. Nucleolus. They get made there.
Oh, okay.
Yep, that's one of the homework questions. And then the nucleus is also obviously where your chromosomes are at. We said in a normal human cell, how many chromosomes are there?
46.
46. And a chromosome is a long chain of what? Yeah, but if this is a chromosome, what's each one of these things? A gene. The whole thing's DNA, right? But each one of these is a gene. And we might say the whole thing's a chromosome. All right, moving along. We then started talking about some other pieces, but we're going to start. Let's start on this picture right here. I want you to think of the cell like a factory. It's a good analogy. Factories make something, right? They have some product that you're trying to make in the end. And how do things normally move around inside a factory? On an assembly line, on like a conveyor belt, right? So I want you to think of a cell like a factory. The nucleus would be like what part of the factory? What's the job of the nucleus? Control, right? Control. So you might think of the nucleus like a boss. Just the boss of the boss's office. That's the nucleus. That's where the boss is at. He's the foreman of the factory. But then the actual machinery that's making the stuff. In a cell, the machinery that actually makes the products of the cell are the ribosomes. Because the products of the cell are what? What are the products the cell makes? Proteins, okay? Ribosomes are like the machinery. So here's the machinery, they make the proteins. A lot of the ribosomes are on top of this organelle right here that's called, we're going to call it the ER, stands for endoplasmic reticulum. The ER that has ribosomes on it, it's called what kind of ER?
Rough ER.
Rough. So these little things are sitting on top of the rough ER. These little chains of circles here, those are supposed to be proteins. What would each circle be? This whole thing's a protein. Each circle is an amino acid. Protein gets made. And once it's made, it falls down here into the ER. I want you to think of the ER sort of like a conveyor belt, because what's its job? What's the ER do? Moves things around inside the cell. You might think of it like a conveyor belt. Now, while that protein is inside that ER, some things are done to it. It's modified a little bit. It may get some things added to it. Its shape may change, but it's moved. It's about transporting the protein inside the cell. Eventually, that protein is going to get to the end of the ER. And what's happening right here? Yeah, the ER is made of a membrane, right? The membrane pinches in on itself, and eventually, pretty much it wraps up that little protein in like a little baggie. What's the word for a baggie in a cell? Look at the slide. A vesicle, okay? A vesicle. Okay? It's like a container, sac. You also sometimes might hear these called vacuoles. So vacuoles, yep, there's a water one in cells. Vacuole or vesicles, those are like storage containers. So the protein gets wrapped in this little container. It leaves the ER. And from there it's going to go to the next organelle, which has several names. Sometimes it's called the Golgi complex. Sometimes the Golgi body. Sometimes it's called the Golgi apparatus. All those are the same thing. What happens when in a factory, when the thing is made and it's at the end of the assembly line? What happens at the end of the line? Well, it gets packed up, which we just did, and then after it's boxed up, what happens to it? It may get shipped out to Best Buy or whoever's buying the thing, but it also might get sent to where? Let's say you haven't sold them yet. You're the guy who's running the factory. You're making TVs, You haven't got a buyer for all these TVs yet, so where do you send them, James?
The warehouse.
You send them to a warehouse. I want you to think of the Golgi apparatus sort of like a warehouse. All the stuff the cell has been making gets sent there. Mostly what happens in a warehouse? They just sit there and wait, right? So some of that happens in the Golgi apparatus. But also, notice it says here that the cell products get modified. Proteins get changed a little bit. They may get some things added to them. Their shape may be changed. But essentially, they're waiting there, waiting to get what? Bought in. Once it's bought, what's going to happen? Shipped out, right? It wants to get shipped out. So what's going to happen when it leaves the Golgi apparatus? It's going to go through a process called exocytosis. Break that word down for me for a minute. Exocytosis. What's exo mean? Exit. Outside. And cyto means? Cyto means cell. Outside the cell. So this little protein is going to get shipped out of the cell. Probably to another cell, to another part of your body. That's exocytosis. Taking a protein that was made inside a cell and sending it out. Another word for that you see in some books is secretion. Something secretes something, it sends it out, right? So the Golgi apparatus helps in secretion or exocytosis. Let me show you kind of how that might look. Here's the Golgi apparatus. Again, it's like a warehouse. It's always located, though, near what part of the cell? Where's that Golgi apparatus? What's it next to?
The cell wall.
It's near the cell membrane, because that's the way out, right? So when it's time for that protein to leave, that protein breaks off that Golgi apparatus in a little vesicle. What's that little vesicle? What are those little baggies made of?
Vacuoles.
Membrane. Phospholipids. Just like what?
Cell wall.
The cell, not the cell wall.
Membrane.
Cell membrane. So when this little vesicle bumps into the cell membrane, what happens?
It pushes out.
What happens if a drop of oil bumps into another drop of oil?
They combine.
They combine. So that happens. A little baggie becomes part of the cell membrane. Well, what happens to the protein that was inside the little baggie? It gets pushed out to the other side. That's secretion or exocytosis. So let's go through the pathway here for a second. Find the slide I wanted to look at here. Maybe I don't have it on here. In just a second. There we go. Sometimes what I just described to you is called the endomembrane system. It's kind of like the factory line in a factory. Start at a ribosome. What do ribosomes do? What do ribosomes do? They make the proteins. The protein goes down into the rough ER. What does it do? What's the job of the rough ER? We said to compare it to what part of the factory? Not so much the line, the conveyor belt. Its job is to do what? Move things around, not outside the cell, just where? Inside the cell. Move things around inside the cell. Also modify the protein a little bit, maybe change its shape, add some things to it like sugars. But think of it like a conveyor belt. Protein gets to the end of the rough ER. It breaks off in a little vesicle, a little baggie. Those vesicles eventually take it to the Golgi apparatus, which I compared to what? What did I just compare the Golgi apparatus to? The warehouse. So that protein gets stored there. It also continues to be modified. It's getting ready to be shipped where?
Outside.
Out of the cell. When it's ready, the protein breaks out in another little vesicle, another little baggie container. That baggie is eventually going to bump into what?
Cell membrane.
Cell membrane. The bag itself becomes part of the membrane, but what happens to the protein inside?
It
gets shipped out. That's exocytosis, or what's the other word we just used? Secretion. And that whole process, that whole set of pieces that I just described to you, is called the endomembrane system. It's pretty much the same in all eukaryotic organisms. It works the same way. Does that make sense? Questions there? Got a couple more cell parts I want to mention. Let's talk next about kind of a cool part. It's called the lysosome. Lysosome. Anytime in biology, and you're going to see that root a lot in biology, L-Y-S, sometimes it's L-Y-T. Anybody know what those letters mean? L-Y-S or L-Y-T? And they're together. Cut, break, tear, split. Cut, break, tear, split. Something like that. Lysosomes. Again, sticking with my factory analogy here. A factory is all about making money, right? So, things that didn't get used, leftovers in a factory. What's going to happen to all the leftovers? Where are they going to send the leftovers after they made their TVs or whatever they're making? Now, let's say you got some extra wire or maybe some extra plastic, or you're going to put it in a recycling bin, right? You're going to recycle it. I want you to think of the lysosomes like the recycling factory, the recycling part of the factory, the recycling center. Because here's what happens. The lysosomes have these really powerful enzymes inside them. And we know enzymes can put together or break apart. But these are enzymes that break apart. They're lytic enzymes, hydrolytic. They break things down. And what they're going to do is anything that's left over, anything that's not needed anymore, they're going to break it down, and then what's going to happen to the pieces of the leftovers? After the leftovers have been broken apart, what's going to happen to the pieces? They're going to get reused, right? Pieces get reused. So think of it like a recycling thing. Lysosomes are real important in your body. When you have cells that die, old worn out, dead cells, they get broken down. The pieces get reused, like the amino acids get reused. Any parts that can be reused are reused. In your white blood cells, what do white blood cells do? They kill germs, right? Pathogens, things that make you sick. They kill them. But when they kill them, what happens to the parts that made up that virus or that bacteria? You break them down into pieces, and then what happens to those pieces? You use them to make you. Okay? So when you get viruses, the proteins and stuff in the viruses, some of those proteins, those amino acids at least, become part of your body. You reuse the parts. That's what the lysosomes do. Think of them like a recycling factory. We already mentioned vacuoles. We're going to use that word vacuole interchangeably with the word vesicle. And we said their job is just to what?
Transport something.
Transport, or just maybe to what?
Dispose.
Store stuff. They're like little bags, storage containers. Think of vacuoles or vesicles, storage containers. You need lots of storage containers in a factory, right? All right, we already talked about the mitochondria. We know it's the site where what happens?
It makes me
No, that makes amino acids. Try again.
ATP.
ATP. It makes ATP using energy coming from where?
Your food.
From your food. So you might think of the mitochondria as like the generator for the factory, right? It's where the electricity is coming from in your factory. Think of it like a generator, a powerhouse. Remember a couple things about mitochondria that you need to know. We already said they produce ATP. The process that actually makes the ATP is cell respiration. Talk a lot about that later. Also remember that mitochondria have their own DNA. And what does that DNA look like? It looks like the DNA from a what? From bacteria. So scientists think that's where they came from, right? They used to be bacteria that were taken in by another cell. We've got maybe two or three more pieces that we need to talk about. The next piece we're going to talk about is a chloroplast.
They're the ones that do like plants and make them green.
Yeah. Chloroplasts are the parts of a plant where photosynthesis happens. The site of photosynthesis. They're the green parts of the plant, right? So what part of a factory, sticking with my factory analogy here, what part of a factory might a chloroplast be like?
Mitochondria.
If you're factory and the person running the factory is kind of environmentally conscious, what might they use to power the factory? Solar panels, right? You might think of the chloroplasts like the solar panels of the factory. They're taking light energy, and in a factory they would convert that light energy into what? Electricity. But in a cell, they're going to take that light energy and convert it into food energy, into sugar. But in a factory, it'll be into electricity. Like the mitochondria, the chloroplasts have their own DNA. That once again looks like what? What do we say about bacterial DNA? It's little single loop, a little single chromosome of DNA. Chloroplasts have the same thing. So scientists think they too used to be a separate bacterial cell, taken in by a bigger cell. Let's see. All right, and then the last two pieces that I'll mention, cilia and flagella. Last two pieces. Cilia and flagella both sort of look like what?
Little tails.
They sort of look like hairs. Which ones are shorter and which ones are longer?
Cilia shorter, flagella.
Cilia are short, flagella are longer. Cilia have several roles, but usually it's movement. Not always, though. A lot of protists have cilia. Think of them like little paddles. Just go back and forth. Help the thing to move. What's one of the most famous protists that you guys have probably heard about in biology before? Name a protist. I heard somebody say amoeba. Does an amoeba have cilia? Nope. What's another one?
Cilia, no.
I know, I just don't know the name.
Paramecium. A paramecium looks sort of like a hairy shoe. Hairy shoe, okay? It's shaped like a shoe, and then on its outer boundary it has lots of little cilia, lots of them. So it looks like a shoe with stubble. And those cilia help it to move. They also help it to get food. Do you have cells in you that have cilia?
Yeah.
A few. Okay? One place you have them is in your respiratory tract. Your windpipe. The tubes going down into your lungs. Why would you want little hairy cells lining the tube that goes down to your lungs? Yeah, here's the deal. There's mucus all in your respiratory tract, right? Do you want that mucus to drain down and pool up in your lungs? That'd be bad, right? Because what likes to grow in mucus? Bacteria, other assorted germs, and you would get pneumonia and you would die if that happened, right? You choke to death on it. So you have these little cilia that are constantly pushing mucus which way?
Up.
Up. Where does the up eventually get you?
Nose. And then your brain.
No. It gets it in your mouth. Okay? Right now, you're eating boogers. Every one of you is, okay?
No one is.
Every one of you is, okay? Those cilia are pushing that mucus up into the back of your throat, and you are swallowing it right down your other tube, which is what? You got the trachea, and then what's the other tube? The esophagus.
That way most just like you constantly
Swallowing. Coughing and swallowing. Coughing and swallowing. Yep. Now, and that's a good thing, because the other alternative is that stuff drains down in your lungs and it makes you really sick. But those cilia push that mucus up. They keep it from pooling up in your lungs. That's a good thing. Smoking. If you were to smoke, what does smoke do to these ciliated cells?
destroy them.
Smoking keeps the cilia from working. It kills the ciliated part. And that's why smokers, if you're a constant smoker, what symptom do you have? You cough all the time because your cilia aren't working. So what's that mucus doing? It's running down, and the only way you can keep it from going down is what? Coughing it up. So that's not a good thing. Another place in the human body that some of you have are fallopian tubes.
I don't have those.
Raise your hand if you have fallopian tubes. All right, just the ladies, right? The fallopian tubes connect your ovaries to what? To your uterus. And there's a little tube that when eggs come out of the ovary, they go through that tube, and they eventually end up in the uterus. The little fallopian tubes are kind of narrow, and the eggs got to go through it. They're kind of windy. So to help the egg through, what's in there? A little silly. They're pushing that egg through the tube. It's like a little gentle. They make a little gentle current that pushes the egg through the tube. All right, the other kind of cell movement organelle we want to talk about are flagella. Flagella are longer. And usually if a cell has flagella, how many does it have?
One.
With flagella, it's usually only one, sometimes two. Cilia, there's usually a lot of them. With flagella, one or two. They're pretty much just longer versions of a cilia. There's some protists. You guys might have talked in regular biology, and we'll see some of these later in this class, about this protist called euglena. And it's cool, because it's sort of almost like an animal, but almost like a plant. If there's no light, what does it do? It starts eating. But if there is light, what does it do? It does photosynthesis. It's kind of cool. It's kind of like half plant, half animal kind of thing. But it has a flagella, and that's how it moves around. The only human cells that I know of that are flagellated are sperm. And that's how they move to get to where they need to go. All right, so let's go back to the factory analogy here and wind this up, and then we'll get ready to go into lab here in a minute. Think of how the cell's like a factory. We said the nucleus is like what part of a factory?
The boss.
Where the boss is. This is the boss's office.
Oh.
It's the boss's office. The cell membrane, we didn't really talk about that in our factory analogy. What part of a factory might it be like?
The structure of
The wall.
the brick wall.
Probably not the wall.
The rebar.
How about the door? Okay? Because what do we say the job of the cell membrane is?
Allows things to come in and
Allow certain things in, certain things out. So we're going to compare it to the door. The cell wall, which some cells have and some don't, would be like the walls of the factory, right? Maybe it's got a fence around it. We said the ribosomes are like the machinery that actually makes the stuff in the factory, right? Because ribosomes make what?
protein.
Proteins. Ribosomes make proteins. Proteins are what your cells make. The rough ER, are we compared to what part of our factory? Yeah, but what part of the factory? Conveyor belt. Move things around inside the factory. As it's being moved around on that conveyor belt, it's getting changed, it's getting modified. Think of it like the conveyor. We said vesicles are sort of like what? Containers, bags. So once the protein leaves the rough ER, it goes in a little vesicle, it goes to the Golgi. And I compared that to what part of the factory? Yeah, but what factory-related thing do we compare the Golgi up with? The warehouse. Proteins get stored there. While they're there, they may get changed a little bit, they may get modified, but they're being stored. When it's time to go, the proteins leave the Golgi apparatus in a little vesicle, a little baggie, box, and eventually they end up where? Out of the cell, right? They go through the cell membrane and they go out. And what was the word for that?
Secretion.
Secretion or exocytosis, out of the cell. All right, and then the other couple things that we mentioned, the mitochondria, we said you might think of it like the generator for the factory. Because your mitochondria creates what? ATP, using energy from food. So you might think of this like the generator. Now, ribosomes make proteins, not ATP. They make proteins. They make the stuff the factory is making. But they can be. But we're talking, think of the protein like whatever the factory's trying to make in my analogy here. Think it's just like a TV factory. The proteins would be the TVs. Chloroplast, we compared to what part of the factory? Solar panels, because they absorb light and use it to make useful energy. And finally, the lysosomes we compared to what part of the factory?
You're recycling.
Recycling center, because they take things that are not used, break them down, and recycle the parts. If you think of the cell, in these terms, I think it'll be easy for you to remember what the parts do. And those are really the parts you need to know about right there. Think of how they compare to a factory, and I think it'll be easy for you to remember what all the parts do. Any questions on that? All right, one more thing I want to talk about. Differences between plant and animal cells. Differences and similarities. Are they more similar or more different?
A little bit similar.
Yeah, they're probably more similar. Because they're both what kind of cells? Both eukaryotic, which means, well, we already said they're both eukaryotic, so that's a similarity. We'll use blue here for similarities. They're both eukaryotic. They both have cell membranes, which are made pretty much the same way. What are cell membranes made out of? What kind of bilayer? Phospholipid. Lipid bilayer. They have most of the same organelles. Things like mitochondria, ER, Golgi apparatus. Most of them are the same. Now, there's also some differences, though. We'll use red for the differences. In terms of a cell wall, plant cells have one, right? Animal cells don't have one. So that's a difference. All cells have vacuoles or vesicles, little storage baggies. But right in the middle of a plant cell is this huge vacuole whose job it is to store what? Water and other assorted things too. Plant cells don't have those huge vacuoles. They usually have just little small ones. So plants have this large water vacuole in the middle. Animal cells, they have smaller vacuoles. They don't have those huge ones. Plant cells have chloroplasts because plants can do what? Photosynthesis. Animal cells do not. It'd be kind of cool if you could just go can out in the sun and make food, right? But you can't. You can't. We'll talk about centrioles later. They're involved in mitosis. Not going to talk so much about them right now. Don't really need to worry about those right now. Those are some similarities and differences between plant and animal cells. Here's the pictures. Animal cell up top. This is the one you drew and labeled. Plant cell down at the bottom. Look at all the things that are the same. Ribosomes here, ribosomes here. Mitochondria here, mitochondria somewhere down here. I don't see them labeled, but there's mitochondria down here too. There's a Golgi apparatus. There's a Golgi apparatus. Nucleus, nucleus. Rough ER, rough ER. Smooth ER, smooth ER. Most of the things are the same. But where you get differences are like the chloroplast in the plant, not in the animal. The wall in the plant cell, not in the animal. Those are the big. That's the big water vacuole we were talking about. So plant cells have that big old water vacuole. Animal cells might have some little vacuoles, but they don't have those huge, big old things in the middle. Does that make sense? All right. Let's do this. Let's get that homework worksheet out. And let's see, get the copy. We have anybody else who wasn't here yesterday? All right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. For today, you're going to get a break if you didn't do this, because we're going to go over this, because I want you to have this to study if you need. So this will be a good little study guide for you. We're going to start on the picture side. So find the picture side of your little diagram. Let me turn off our recording real quick.